and to help them become more resilient. Oh, I'm getting lots of feedback, sorry. Yeah, so I engage with communities and I do a lot of work with schools to help them become more resilient and be able to deal with flooding much more, much better in the future.
Thanks, Tina. And again, if I can just go to Liz, please. Liz Witcher, would you please, just a courtesy, tell us a little about yourself and your role with the Watton and Sayham Tony Flood Action Group, please?
So our group was formed 4.5 years ago, following flooding in 2016. We have worked very hard to know all we can about the water systems and the highway systems and Anglian water systems in our town. And we have a great deal of local knowledge. And we've been working together with the agencies for the last 2 years particularly, and we're at last getting some action, and that's very pleasing. There are 7 of us. It's really the Watton and Sayham Flood Action Group, because as well as Sayham Tony, the village, there's Sayham Hills, which is another bit of the village. And we've got action in both places and work together with the agencies, and that's absolutely critical in getting things done.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks for that introduction. And Charlie, if you would, again, please do us the courtesy of just informing our colleagues this afternoon about your role, please.
Yeah, happily. Good afternoon, Charlie Carter. So I work for Norfolk's Local Resilience Forum. It's an organisation set up after the Civil Contingencies Act of 2004, and it's basically just an organisation to help Category 1 and Category 2 responders plan, prepare, and sort of train in preparation for emergency events. So it focuses across all sort of spectrum of risks that we might see for Norfolk. Today, obviously, is just a focus specifically on flooding for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. And finally, myself. So I'm Richard Herrell. I'm actually retired fire officer, 34 years Norfolk Fire and Rescue, obviously part of Norfolk County Council. I've come back to support the service in an emergency planning role, one of which, and a big part of my role nowadays, is to look at how we can develop local resilience programs within our communities, and certainly supporting the Norfolk Strategic Flood Alliance in spreading the word about the opportunities that are out there, education with regard to flooding initiatives. So that's pretty much us as a team this afternoon, and the way we're going to run this afternoon is as a collective. So colleagues will be jumping in and out, looking for opportunities to speak and make comment on salient areas, but hopefully we've got a wide range of areas with regard to flooding that we'd like to cover with you this afternoon. And hopefully you'll find it very informative, and you'll enjoy it and get a lot from it. So this afternoon, the aim of the session this afternoon is really to support you. From a parish perspective, you are local leaders, and sometimes leadership can be a lonely place when people are looking to you with regard to trying to help communities, particularly when we're dealing with emergencies. The focus this afternoon is about flooding, but in terms of local resilience and setting up systems to enable us to help others, we shouldn't just be flood centric. The natures of community emergencies are very wide ranging, and we're going to go into that in a bit more detail as we go on and progress through the afternoon. This should be an informative presentation to you this afternoon, and like Jeremy mentioned earlier, don't worry if we move on at a pace, because obviously we've got a lot to get through, but there are hyperlinks in our presentation, and when you get the PDF copy of the presentation from this afternoon, it will enable you to go to the various different locations within various different council sites, websites, Environment Agency and other guidance documents. So there's a wealth of information, and I think the way that you might wish to consider this presentation this afternoon is the development of a go-to guide. Somewhere where you can go to get that information that you need, should you need to do so, and spread the word and increase the general knowledge amongst your teams, which you are part of within the parishes of Norfolk. Another thing that we're looking to do this afternoon is to, I'd use the word quite openly, is demystify flooding in some respects by looking at the types and the nature of flooding characteristics that we may encounter in our life, and particularly that with regard to the way that we might want to consider flooding from an emergency response perspective, and the way that we should consider it, and maybe the way that we should think about these things. And in doing that, moving on to the next point, is thinking about the ways that we could probably warn and inform ourselves or our parishes and our communities about when flood may be prevalent or imminent, and the types of things that we should be doing in terms of making ready some form of preparedness or action plan, but essentially enabling you this afternoon to see what the flood risk systems should actually mean to you. And that necessarily focuses on the next part of the opportunities to look at how you could possibly develop a flood plan or an emergency plan. And again, the culmination of this afternoon is looking at the importance of local knowledge, that knowledge that's embedded with you within your local parishes, and certainly within your parishioners. Certainly coming from an emergency service background, your local police, fire and ambulance officers will have a good ground knowledge of your local areas and communities, but they don't have the exact bespoke knowledge that you have at your disposal with people that have lived their full lives in the county of Norfolk, or have a wide inquiry in mind to seek and find out facts about the communities. But certainly what you'll tend to find when we're dealing with the flooding is that local knowledge is absolutely key, and the emergency services certainly don't know it all. Some might think they do, but they don't know as much as you do about your community. So this is about recognizing that skill and that local community leaders. So moving on to the general arrangements for the webinar this afternoon, and hopefully you're all safe and well. A lot of you will probably be working from home, but if you're not, please we respect the fact that you've got local procedures that may prevail with regard to offices that you might be working from. So please stay safe and take whatever action you need to do so throughout our presentation this afternoon. Also, Jeremy's isolated the microphone, so that means it's going to be difficult to raise verbal questions. So the way that we would look to support you in responding to any questions you might have, if you can just post your questions in the chat function, and as a team we'll look at those questions and we'll fire them back in whilst one of us are on our feet, to hopefully we can get a timely response to any questions that you might have. If unfortunately we can't get all the way through it, then what we'll do, we'll try and pick up the questions at the end, and if there's still some at the end of it, we'll endeavour to get back to you with the questions, answer the questions that that you're obviously going to ask. As no doubt with the variance of knowledge and experiences that you have in flooding in your communities, there's going to be lots of questions, so we can only do our best to get through them, so please bear with us. So to set the scene then, I mean, it should be no surprise to anyone that our climate is changing, and the focus we have this afternoon is looking at flooding in particular. The statistics that we're presented up here this afternoon to you is that 5 million people in England and Wales work or live in areas that are at risk from flooding from rivers or the sea. Now, you know, in terms of major flood events, all of us would have sadly seen the massive floods in Germany in the summer of this year, and the massive disruption that has brought to the community, and ultimately resulted in the ultimate loss and multiple loss of lives, and the tragic outcomes in there, even despite the best endeavours of the emergency services to rescue people that were trapped in the floodwater. And it just shows the compelling nature of flooding. In terms of a local context, in Norfolk, there is over 42,000 properties that potentially are at risk. So consequently, we need to have a significant eye on this challenge that is presented to us, in terms of the way that we may wish to prepare, the way that we need to respond, and the way that we may wish to start thinking about flooding in the way that we deal with it if we're not already doing so. In fact, many of you, I would suggest, may unfortunately been victims of flooding, or you know people that have, you'll know businesses that have been compromised by it. And what you'll tend to find is that flooding is indiscriminate. In some areas, it's predictable if it's near a particular type of water source, but in other occasions, it can be quite sporadic and indiscriminate in terms of rainfall or other dynamics of thawing snow, stuff like this, which presents us with a multifaceted problem. And so it follows on then that there is a need to have a wider awareness of the nature of flooding, and hopefully by the end of the presentation you will have a wider perspective on flooding and the types of it, and gives you some ideas of types of things that we might want to be thinking about in our positions as community leaders. So let's just take a quick snapshot really of a local event to just bring it again into more of a local perspective. The information that I'm presenting here is as the title suggests, it's a short snapshot of a flooding event that occurred in Norfolk over the 23rd and 24th of December last year. And the maps and diagrams on the right indicate the location of where these events occurred. It was during a period of heavy rainfall, and again we're going to come into the nature of flooding types and surface water flooding later in the presentation. But the top picture there, the size of the blue indicators there indicates the actual number of calls that were received in those relative locations in Norfolk over that period of time. And I'm sure you can correlate the diagrams and the maps there with the statistics over on the left hand side. You'll see there's some really quite compelling data that comes out of the challenges that our communities were facing over that period of time. I've just focused in the South Norfolk area predominantly in this particular snapshot, but suffice to say many other areas of the county were also challenged for a significant period of time. And again, this is something we're going to talk about later in the presentation, about the legacy of flooding and how we need to think about recovery strategies and plans to try and get our communities back on their feet. But if I can just draw your attention, particularly to the top statistic there, and actually look at the fact that 17% of the overall calls that Norfolk Fire and Rescue Service received in that short period of time will indicate to you the severity and the challenges of what spontaneous rain in this case can actually bring, and the nature of the problems, particularly in terms of immediate threat to life and persons. I mean, it's quite unprecedented for the fire and rescue services to have what I would call a relatively short period of time, but in terms of 17% of the incidents that the fire and rescue service were attending at that time required us to rescue people from their vehicles or from water, or indeed from their properties. And again, looking further down on the list there, the amount of flood advice that fire and rescue was needing to provide just to advise our callers on the 39 system and the emergency number of what to do. And in some cases, some of these calls, whilst might need to or be made to seek reassurance through the impending threat, or people generally being concerned for their own safety and welfare or that of others, a high volume of calls to provide advice again presents a real challenge, and I hope you'll realise the magnitude of the event that we were all trying to work with there. And again, it's not just the fire service responding to this, it's our colleagues in the police, our colleagues in the highway department, Norfolk County Council, and all the other departments that will be activated to try to respond, to try and mitigate as best we can the challenges that are presented by flooding. I think one of the things that really stands out for me on some of the rescues that were performed in this short period of time, in fact, it was the rescue of 2 people from a vehicle in actually a location not too far away from where I live, just outside Norwich, where had the fire and rescue service not been there in time, I'm sure the outcome of the event would have been tragic. So the 2 people rescued from a vehicle where I believe there was a very limited airspace left in a road that I would suggest is quite innocuous, but just goes to show, whilst earlier I presented the compelling challenges associated with the German experience in summer of this year, but just goes to show these types of events can happen in Norfolk, and the rate in which they can happen is rapid and can really catch people out. So the sooner we can find out about the potential impending nature of these threats, or have knowledge about where they could be when they do occur, again, these are all great things to know about and to have some form of preparedness to enable us to make a proportionate level of actions, either at a community level or certainly in support of the emergency services. What I'd like to do now is
Richard, people
Yes,
are
go ahead.
saying in the chat that you keep fading in and out. I don't know whether you can do anything about that.
Okay, I probably can't with my connection, unfortunately. Hopefully the recorded version will pick up any detail that colleagues are unable to pick up. But I shall do my best. But thank you, Liz, for the feedback. In terms of moving on, one of the things that I certainly found quite challenging is in trying to describe flooding is the varying types of flooding challenges that are out there, and trying to make sense of it all in terms of understanding the nature of the problem before we try to manage it. So the next part of this presentation, I'm going to hand over to Charlie, and Charlie's going to give you an overview of the typical types of flooding challenges that we have, and hopefully give you some worked examples. So over to Charlie, and who hopefully has got a stronger signal than myself. Over to you, Charlie.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Hopefully everyone can hear me. So the first type of flooding, just quickly ripping through these, will be coastal flooding is our biggest sort of threat or risk. Of particular notice when we see storm surges, which is where you'll see a low pressure system, and even worse if you have high tides, which will lead to a tidal lock. So the tides don't actually leave the system, so you then get almost a double high tide, which is particularly bad for Norfolk when you get that northeasterly wind pushing that tide and that high water in towards the land, leading to overtopping of the coastal defences, significant risk for erosion, and you've also got the risk of coastal inundation leading to evacuation. Next slide, please. So rivers, that's the picture at the top there, that's the River Waveney from 2013. And so fluvial flooding, just for terminology, that's when basically the rivers just can't cope with the amount of water draining into them, and they burst their banks and then lead to flooding sort of from that location. Next slide, please. Fluvial flooding, also referred to as surface flooding, that's just when you have a really heavy downpour and the drainage systems are just overwhelmed by the amount of water being delivered into them, can't manage it, and that's where you see that surface flooding water you often see around roads, especially in the autumn when you've got blocked drains, etc. Groundwater being slightly different, where you might not see the effects of groundwater until sort of weeks or months later, when you've had after persistent long periods of rain, and that's when the water table actually rises, and then you'll see the water rising above the surface of the ground. It's a more challenging problem than most of the other ones due to the size of it, but you can't sort of protect a lot of these things from sandbags as you would do for most other types of flooding or your normal floodboard defences. You've got you're looking at more sort of other options such as pumping, trying to get that water out of there. Obviously, it's groundwater, so the places like cellars, basements are most at risk of this sort of flooding. Next slide, please. And then you've got your sewers. So that's two things: either when a sewer is overwhelmed by the volume of water coming down into it, or it can also just be due to blockages. And so, sorry, hopefully, Jean, you can hear me if I speak up a little bit. And so the last one, obviously, sewers. So it's either blockages or due to the amount of water going into them, and that's that can be impacted by a number of things, including the age, size, and diameters and sort of those drainage systems. We'll talk about some of the organisations involved in flooding later on, and what they're doing to invest in preventing some of these issues occurring again. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Charlie. What I'm going to do now is hand over to Tina, and Tina's going to hopefully demystify the flood landscape and hopefully present the who does what in this challenge that we face. So, Tina, over to you. If you could.
Hi. Right. So, as far as members of the public are concerned, they really don't care where it's come from, what it's doing, as long as somebody's going to sort it out or help advise them how they can sort it out. But so so many organisations actually are involved in the flood landscape. So you've got the Environment Agency. So we look after coast and main rivers. That's our the world of water that we look after. Then you've got oh gosh, I'm choking now. You've got Norfolk County Council and Highways and the LLFA. So I've been talking and now, excuse me. They are looking after surface water. Obviously, you've got the water companies, so Anglian Water, and any other water companies are looking after what's happening as far as the water side of things. Then you've got, and it's very rare, and they're not that many around the country, but the East Anglia has the most internal drainage boards than any other part of the country. So we have IDBs, internal drainage boards, and they are, so all those small rivers or kind of drains all across Norfolk and Cambridgeshire, that's IDB world. Then you go into the local authorities and obviously their whole emergency planning provision right across the area. Then you've got emergency services, fire and rescue, the police, and that whole community support. So they're the kind of key kind of agencies that look after. And I'm handing back to Charles to talk about the NSFA. Gosh, I'm going to choke now. Thank you.
Christina, you're right. So the Norfolk Strategic Flood Alliance was set up after the flooding from the 23rd of December last year, and then the subsequent flooding that we also experienced later on in February after that snowmelt. And so headed up by Lord Dannatt, that's basically a strategic group involving all the organisations listed above by Tina, with the intention of basically improving our water management processes and our preparation, response and recovery to flooding events, basically just leading to better coordination between these services to improve how we deal with these things. I hope that covers just that. Hopefully will answer some of the questions put forward by Tony Dawes, put something in the chat there asking what's the coordination between Norfolk and Suffolk. As mentioned, a number of these organisations are pan county and don't really see the county lines that we see. So there's coordination at that level there. You've also got the Suffolk Resilience Forum. So every county has a local resilience forum. So we work quite closely with Suffolk, obviously because of just save on duplication of effort. So we're quite closely tied in with them anyway. And then just while I go through these points, just going through some of the points in the chat, Pat, your point about weather warnings, etc. There will be there's a number of hyperlinks within this document that are used to warn and inform parishes, clerks, the general public through a multitude of different means. So hopefully you'll be able to receive those when we send out the PDF anyway. I think there were some weather warnings provided on the 23rd, but it was quite a flash, a sudden sort of surface water flash event. So I think it wasn't a great amount of time and warning there. Hopefully that covers some of those answers. As more chat questions come in, I will answer them. Thank you. Over to you, Richard.
Yeah, thanks for that, Charlie.
Hang on a minute, Richard. I'm just going to throw in as the Environment Agency, and obviously we look after rivers, and just because there's a county boundary doesn't mean to say a river doesn't go across from one place to the other. The River Waveney is a prime example. And actually, as an organisation, we work incredibly close with both Norfolk and Suffolk county councils, because water will go where it wants to and not where the boundaries say it should. So just to say.
Thanks for that, Tina. Again, just for colleagues' awareness, we mentioned about the hyperlinks. The hyperlink at the bottom of this slide will take you to a really good government website section that describes the above mentioned organisations and authorities in a lot more detail. So hopefully this is just giving you an open sort of initial heads up, so to speak, with regard to the nature of the organisations that are involved in this landscape, and enables us to sort of move on now to the next slide, which again is for Charlie, is just talking about how risk is managed or considered from a flooding perspective by the Resilience Forum. So Charlie, back to you.
Nearly. Thank you. So as I said, I work for the Norfolk Resilience Forum, and we have the Norfolk Prepared website, open access. Anyone can obviously visit that and look at it. On there, you have a community risk register, which just quantifies and puts a risk and impact and likelihood against the risk that we face in Norfolk. We break down the flooding into those constituent elements there and focus on the different risks and elements involved in each of them. As you can see, coastal being of greatest concern, followed by the fluvial, and then the surface water flooding concerns. There are one of the greatest challenges, obviously, with this is that surface water flooding can occur anywhere, and so preparations. It doesn't mean just because you're not near a river, etc., it doesn't mean you're not or at great risk of a sudden flash surface water flooding event, and that ties in with some of the points that why it's important for sort of all communities to have that preparation to understand what the risks are or where those risks are specific and pertinent to their communities. So you can have a look online, and there's a number of opportunities on there to sort of help support communities in creating their plans. We'll cover that a little bit further on. Thank you. Mute Richard.
Yeah, sorry, someone's muted me. Hopefully you can hear me now. I think we should be good to go. So the nature of the consequences that that come out of these flooding challenges again are various, and the next section is talking about what they are. Some of them might seem obvious, but some of them are in some respects arguably a bit more sinister or a bit more latent or a bit more shadowed away from what you'd expect. So again, just going back to Tina, talking about flooding types, the consequences, Tina. So I think this first one's over to you, please.
Hi, right, so I mean, this picture just shows a typical example of what can happen when your home is flooded and what devastation is caused. The damage to homes, possessions, businesses, and infrastructure. And I talk to people who've been flooded all the time. They could be out of their house for a few days. They could be out of their house for most of the year. And doesn't really matter how short or long it is, the devastation that has been caused. And I know a lot of the people who were flooded on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day last year will be in a really bad state leading up to this year, putting up their Christmas tree, putting up their decorations, because the last time they saw them, they were floating off in their lounge and the presents and everything else. And when you have families a guy contacted me about 2 weeks ago, and we were talking about various things, and he had to leave his house on Christmas Eve with 3 children under the age of 11 on Christmas Day at 11 o'clock in the morning. So Santa had just been, and now they all had, and all their presents and everything, and their whole day was totally ruined because of flooding. It will probably last them a lifetime. Every time Christmas comes, they will remember back to when they were flooded on Christmas Day. And actually, the damage to business is huge. That you can look at places in Cumbria who have worked really hard to become more resilient in their businesses. I don't know if anybody's seen that flood program that was on ITV a few months the end of in November, and this particular store it was a shoe shop, and it had all its shoes on racks on the walls, and when it was flooding they all raised up and were attached to the ceiling, so actually all their stock was safe and secure. But it's actually because they had really thought about their resilience. So damage to homes, possessions, business and infrastructure is absolutely huge. And we've all seen with storm damage when they've had to rebuild railway lines and the like. So it's massively expensive and massively damaging.
Thanks, Tina.
And now we'll move on back to Richard.
Yeah. So I've mentioned earlier, we mentioned earlier in the presentation about the nature of some of the sort of compelling rescues that Norfolk unfortunately had to endure in the December floods. And so we can't understate the potential risks here when we're talking about floodwater. And to the untrained eye, it can look quite innocuous. I think, well, it's only a small bit of floodwater trickling down or running down there, but misjudge it at your peril, really. certainly from a fire and rescue service perspective, sadly over the years I've been involved in recovery of many drowning victims or vehicles that have gone into flood water and people need to be rescued. And the same way for animals as well. You know, it's just has such a wide remit in terms of the nature of victims. We talked earlier around homes and people being displaced, but the nature of, you know, the flooding challenges that would present is, you know, people die in these types of events as well as being displaced. So, you know, we can't understate that. Certainly on one of my sort of engagements, and again with Liz in the Watton area, and I'll come on to Liz in a moment, is one of the other challenges where Charlie was talking earlier about sewers. One of the things you get in high volume water events is sometimes the sewers can become overwhelmed and manhole covers become displaced. Now, in terms of the untrained eye, or certainly persons who are not trained to work in flood water, a displaced manhole cover is basically a man trap. It's actually a death trap. And in some cases, we've come across in Norfolk where we've actually got members of the public who are familiar with the drainage systems, and they think it's a good idea to start lifting manhole covers under their own volition, really. Now you can imagine what a manhole cover which has been uncovered with raging water surging throughout the sort of subterranean element of the system, and what it could be like for a person or a child who thinks it's fun to walk around in it, or persons thinking they're doing the right thing and suddenly being lost in some sort of drainage system. I mean, it doesn't bear thinking about, but unfortunately it does happen. Thankfully, to my knowledge, it hasn't happened in Norfolk, but it just goes to show that, you know, people will take risks, and because they don't understand the nature of the problems. Even flood water moving at 2 or 3 inches deep, and it's easy for a vehicle to hydroplane over the surface of the water, lose control, and again, people walking through it presenting themselves the challenges. There's also the challenges of the nature of the content of the flood water, containing sewerage, maybe chemical waste through effluent plants that get overwhelmed. It's a massive challenge, and coupled with the points that Tina mentioned earlier, the psychological impacts. You know, it will last in the minds of victims forever, and those that are there to try and support them. You know, these are massive events. It's not just about recovery in terms of getting people back in the houses. It's the actual challenge to people's general welfare and mental well-being that we need to think about. And again, looking at it from a community perspective, what would you do if you had someone who was in that nature of displacement? How do you think you could support them? What sort of challenges would they need to overcome? Imagine what that might be like if you were out of your own home for 6 or 12 months, waiting for your property to dry out. And again, Tina gave a good example there of a very young family who had to be displaced from the home. But imagine an elderly or an infirm or an ambulant person or person with needs. How would they need to be supported by the community after the flood waters have subsided? We're going to come on to that in the ways that we might want to think about supporting those individuals or those people or communities in a while. But if we can move on to the other elements of challenge of when we're dealing with displaced people, is the evacuation. Now, evacuation in a coastal sense is a well organised, well, it certainly has a wealth of plans ready to go in terms of the potential for coastal inundation and the way that we would need to think as a community to people that are in an imminent risk or position where they could be vulnerable. Explaining a little bit to our colleagues about how shelter systems work and how the resilience forums come together to identify these sites and the way this process works. Hello, Charlie.
Sorry, struggling. I was on the chat there for a second. Thank you very much. Thank you. So, talking through the evacuation and shelter issues, I was just replying to Janine Curtis. The local authority emergency planning officers are an excellent avenue for communicating a number of the issues that you face at the parishes. So that they won't be able to fix a lot of things they can't fix directly, but they can also help make sure that issues are raised or directed to the right departments within the local authority. A lot of the frustrations that we see are when people have issues, but they don't know exactly where to articulate them to, and then people see them not as their role and therefore don't action. So we'll cover more about it, but emergency planning officers are really important in this process. And they, for one other thing, they have evacuation and rest shelter plans. They all have them, they're important. I mean, Great Yarmouth has a plan to evacuate up to 20,000 people if required. But it's really important to make sure that the parishes understand these plans, have reached out or have that lines of communication with the emergency planning officers to understand what's available close to them so that they can sort of mutually support and aid each other. I'll cover a little bit more later, but the contact details for the emergency planning officers are on the Norfolk Prepared website as well. I'd encourage anyone to look at that and reach out. I myself am helping prepare some documents that will be delivered to the emergency planning officers as sort of almost as an olive branch to the parishes to open up some lines of communication. So they're a great option for a number of things. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. In terms of another element of this is sometimes the amount of time that we have available to consider evacuation. Good weather intelligence and the knowledge of the nature of our communities and the way that our sort of dynamics work with regard to weather and flood potential are well established and well known. So in most cases, we know when we may have a large scale problem. But in terms of surface water flooding, again, we're going to come on to a bit more detail that later in the presentation. Sometimes there is no notice. And if I can just turn to Liz, in terms of some of the knowledge that you have, if you could just tell our colleagues with regard to some of the flooding challenges that you have. In some cases, after 20 minutes from a certain amount of rainfall, just how challenging the situation in Watton can be. Would you just like to share your experience on that for us, please?
Yes, indeed. And when I've done that, perhaps I can respond to the comments about planning that have been on the chat as well. Okay. I mean, because we've been working for so long and because we have access to a weather buff in Watton who records daily rainfall, we've worked out in what period of time and how much rain leads to flooding in certain of our streets. And so we can try to activate people to warn people about that. And because we have a very small main river, it's just a little brook, it doesn't flood. Our flooding is all surface water flooding. And because we've had so much new development, we have so much hard surface that it just all flows down the roads and gets into the foul sewers that way. And they surcharge like mad. People have also mentioned misconnections. And I know for a fact that Anglian Water say to us, they haven't got the resources to identify misconnections, but if anybody thinks there are misconnections, they should report them to Anglian Water. And Anglian Water are about to start a project in Watton where they're going to be dealing with the misconnections in our very ancient high street and replacing them with other ways of doing things. So surface water flooding and getting into the sewers is really very difficult, and it stops the pumping stations from working. And we have 6 in Watton and 5 in Salem, and they just stop working, and that's a big problem. So in our area, the whole thrust of everything is Anglian Water working with the highways and the lead flood authority to reduce the amount of water in getting into the foul sewers. That's going to be quite a long job, but we're getting started on it. And if I could just say a bit about planning. I mean, we've been working with our parish council. I mean, we started from our neighbourhood plan, so we were very connected with our town council, but we're more separate now, but we still work closely with them. And we've now made representation every so often on all the planning applications that we think are flood risk. And like everybody says, we're not listened to. And because I'm connected to the National Flood Forum, I know that this is a nationwide problem. And one of the problems is that the sustainable drainage systems are constructed from models. and there will be quite senior professorial people who will say the models are flawed. But that's what we've got. And if the local flood authority said, the lead local flood authority says these sustainable drainage systems are fine, even if you can show and talk about all the flooding on the area, somehow the planning committee doesn't seem to be able to go against the planning officers who say because the SUDs are okay, we can go ahead. I think there's going to be a lot of moves in relation to that at the parliamentary level, because the National Flood Forum in particular, and Lord Danat and his team also are really pushing the link between planning and flooding, and that really this has to be connected up, and all sorts of things that they're planning to do with the new planning law just isn't something that they should be doing. But, you know, we know how long processes like that are. But I'm happy to say anything else if it would help.
Thanks for that, Liz. That's an excellent overview, and you've covered a lot of ground there. And if I can just focus on one particular point, obviously respecting your knowledge with and your experiences on from the planning side and the national picture, but summarising what you've just said there, a lot of the knowledge that you have is based on experience of speaking to other people, and I think sort of representative of the work that you've done and the work that you've needed to do to establish the sort of the ground truth or the facts of the way that your hydrology, for want of another word, actually works. So I know by visiting you and your group over the last few months, you know, the group that you have there in Watton and how you're tied in with the council there, the town council that is you've got a very robust picture of the nature of flooding, what typically what situations look like immediately prior to, and again, the nature of the challenges that communities can face, and I think that's representative of the sort of position that maybe parish councils might want to think about in, you know, what would good look like in terms of being prepared for an impending challenge, whether it be flooding or severe weather or anything of that nature, because I don't think these things can really be understated. But I know the amount of work that you and your team put in, Liz, you know, you have to go out there and look for it. So first of all, well done for that, and again, thank you for the overview with regard to the planning picture.
If I can just say, I mean, certainly. I said at the beginning, we've been going for 4.5 years, and I think there was a parish council person who said, you know your area, and I'm sure you do. It took us 2 years of sending reports with evidence to get the agencies to listen to us. So evidence, and the National Flood Forum says the same. So you need to get it written down in photographs, in reports, and sent to people that you want to influence.
Thank you, Liz, and again, excellent summary of your experiences and the way that you've gone about it. And I think, again, so that I can just move on, obviously we've got a lot of content to go through. You know, it's not a quick process. It takes a lot of commitment, and, you know, as community leaders, from the parish council perspective, or in terms of local groups that are there to support others, you know, it's not a quick win. It does take work, but, you know, if we've got the resolve to push forward, then I'm sure that everyone on this line is in those positions to look at this challenge in a slightly different way if they weren't already doing so. And again, looking in this presentation to the ways to find information so that hopefully can get a jump start and hopefully avoid having to do too much groundwork, so you can hit the ground running in terms of developing like an emergency plans and having a little bit more awareness of your communities if you haven't already done so. So if I can just turn to Charles now, just talk briefly around challenges with regard to utilities and transport services. Charles, if you just would like just to give a very brief overview on that, please.
Yeah, of course. Apart from the obvious issues that flooding causes to transport services and things like that, it's just of note, linking to that point about evacuation. Normally parish individuals don't want to evacuate, obviously due to the fear of looting or anything else, just what they feel safer at home. But it's just something to consider, how safe is a home if it has no electricity, because there's no power to the property, being in a wet property for 3 or 4 days. without any power, does it remain a safe place? So it's trying to ensure that people understand the risks that are inherent, not only at that very moment, but in the longer term. And that's where you sort of need that leadership from the community to say, think longer term, get out. And that's part of that planning process, understanding what's the risk now and in the future. Thank you.
Can I just throw in there, I do a lot of work with schools, and when I had a he must have been about 10-year-old boy saying to me that his father had said that they weren't evacuating because if they were going to die, they were all going to die together. When you have a 10-year-old boy saying that to you, you really aren't, we're definitely not getting our messages through that actually we want people to evacuate. And when I go into schools, the thing I really put over about when you're asked to evacuate, please do, because actually if you don't, you're putting other people's lives in risks when you do need to be evacuated. And that's something I really push forward with the children. I do a lot of work with year sixes because I find they're like sponges, and they will go home and share those messages with their families. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tina. Some really excellent points coming out here in terms of, I think, how we as sort of community leaders and emergency services can influence others in terms of recognizing when things are so dangerous. There really is no point actually staying in location. Certainly from my experience back in 2013 when we had a large coastal inundation, I recall one of my colleagues being in a local command unit based out in North Norfolk, a place called Bacton. And some of the challenges there where people just generally don't want to leave their homes, and I fully respect and understand why that is, and the compelling challenge that individuals will have around security and just don't want to go. But equally, there are other challenges for the emergency services, of course, because if the situation becomes so treacherous, then these people need to be rescued. And so it's my colleagues from fire and rescue, police and ambulance are the people that have got to go in there and try and enable a rescue to be performed in a timely way. And again, going back to evacuation processes, in many cases, thankfully, we do get some form of heads up, particularly in terms of coastal inundation, because of the aforementioned low pressures and wind directions. We know when things could get bad. But in some cases, for a house to be displaced, weather forecasting is some really good indicators for people who unfortunately live in areas that get compromised. What I'd like to do now is just move on and start talking around. I just want to cover, environmental damage as well. I mentioned earlier around the sewerage challenges, but and again, I'm going to ask Tina to come in and make a comment again in a moment with regard to the challenges with sandbags, etc. But don't forget, floodwater is dangerous not just from the flooding risk, but also from the contamination content as well. All sorts of nasty bacteria, again, chemical effluents that can overwhelm various different drainage systems or interceptors that can cause all sorts of materials to be in floodwater. So in some cases it might look fun for young children, but actually it could contain some quite nasty materials that could do significant damage to your health. So not only does it compromise your properties and also present a very significant life risk, but there's also maybe the delayed action of ingestion of this type of material, or certainly irritant to the skin, as well as trip hazards beneath the surface, or in the case of more treacherous flooding, large obstacles or entanglement coming downstream. But Tina, would you just like to quickly cover the issues around sewerage with regard to sandbags, please, so that our colleagues can hear a bit more about that, please?
Well, just to recap on what Richard's just said, another thing that I do with the children is I do an underwater risks and dangers tank. And so I have a tank which is filled with kind of looks like disgusting water, but it's actually coffee. And in there I have all sorts of items that children or anybody could find in the water, from plastic poo to dead animals to trees and cables. And I go through that whole scenario of what might be under the water. And I also go through that message of when they see adults in water, that they should really be going, do you know what's in it? So just bring that to their minds, that actually it might look fun when they see these people walking through the flood water, but actually when they really think about what's in it, they really change their mind. The other thing I would like to bring up, the subject is around sandbags. Obviously, the Environment Agency do not provide sandbags, and your councils do not provide sandbags on the whole. Basically, sandbags, but it's the thing that everybody asks for as soon as it starts flooding, and actually they are probably the least useful thing if you're not prepared. To become more resilient, you need to think better than sandbags. You need to think about flood defences. You need to think about other things that can protect your property. Because at the end of when the flooding water has gone down, all you're left with is a contaminated sandbag that you then have to legally get rid of it in an appropriate way. Whereas if you have got flood barriers or flood doors, you can wash them, disinfect them, clean them all down, and actually they're ready to go again. Whereas actually your sandbags are now contaminated waste, and they need to be got rid of in that way. So there's lots of new things that can be, that can be used. But actually, the thing that I hear on the news, when you ever see a story, they always go, they didn't have any sandbags. But actually, if you read any literature from any organisation, they actually don't provide sandbags. And it's something that parish councils need to be aware of, or what they're going to do instead of sandbags. We might have sandbags on backs of trucks, as in the Environment Agency, but that is to hold down sheeting around flood defences, not to block up people's doors. So it's something to really think about, and that's where preparation and being more resilient is more important, because actually I hate the word sandbag and it drives me nuts, but hey, I'm in the Environment Agency, so that's it.
Thanks for that, Tina. You mentioned in that element there around response and looking towards what we're going to do then in terms of emergency plans and the types of things that we might want to think about. And we've covered a wide range of hazards, dynamics, characteristics, from evacuation through to all the different natures that a problem that flooding presents to us in our community. So we sort of turn now to ask the question, well, what can we do about it then? Well, what I'd like to introduce to you now is a very basic planning concept or principle. It's nothing too in depth. It's just an overarching set of principles: prevent, assess, anticipate, and you can see on the screen: prepare, plan, and activate, respond, and recover. These are the basic elements of emergency response, and again, they form the foundation of how your emergency services operate when called to duty, the way that they structure their services in dealing with the challenges that they are that are presented to them. It presents a really good solid foundation for anyone who's now looking at putting a plan together about, well, what we're going to do and how we're going to do it, and the way that we want to structure ourselves in trying to move forward. So the first element of this is prevention. I know it's the old adage, prevention is better than cure, but if we look at the principle of flood prevention, Tina's mentioned some of it in terms of active response, in terms of that dreaded word sandbag. Sorry, Tina, I know you don't like it. But if we look at prevention in the first instance, I think when we look at the ways and means of preventing the problem in the first place, yeah, there might be some design issues and civil engineering challenges to look at wide scale problems. But in many cases, there are lots of simple cures. A lot of the challenges are, what we have here is some sort of some character pictures here around the nature of the problems you could have, surface water flooding, flooded pathways, blocked drains. The hyperlink at the bottom of the screen here, and again, you'll have this on a copy of the PDF, is a very, very useful tool for you. It takes you straight into the Norfolk County Council website, and it provides you with an array of the different difficult types of challenges that might be indicative of or caused by flooding. And by enabling this link and going into it, unfortunately, I can't show you at the moment because of technical reasons, but if you were to go into this link, it shows you a very, very simple self-help suite of measures and tools that you can access, for example, to direct the council to become aware of a drain that's blocked through leaves or standing water or anything of that nature. And I think one of the challenges that we do have out there is always the assumption that someone else has reported it. Is, well, someone else is dealing with it. It's pretty obvious that there's a problem there and someone else is dealing with it. But if we don't take the initiative, or if we don't tell people how easy it is to raise the challenge, then maybe, you know, it's not going to go away too quickly. So in terms of raising awareness, again, this tool here is very, very useful in directing you to see the tactics or the measures that are in place to enable you to report problems when they arise. In many cases, again, through the Norfolk County Council website, there are ways to activate a call in terms of a block drain, for example, and you can do it anonymously as well, or you can do it with a means of tracking your inquiry to make sure it's being followed up. So there's a good way of making sure that you can do the right thing and just raise attention to the council that there are these problems. And again, when you go into this site, and again, I do apologize, but for technical reasons, I can't get into it today. But it also offers up lots more information with regard to flooding, associated maybe with local landowners, drainage systems, and other nuanced challenges that we've been discussing today. And I think one thing that that is also that seems to get ignored or overlooked is, again, that assumption that, well, it's only a minor problem. But you know, minor problems have larger consequences if they accumulate, and I think that's really an important message to get across. Is, you know, no flooding problem's too small. You know, if any doubt, you know, make the call, turn it out in terms of reporting the challenges as you find them. So again, within the Norfolk County Council site, there are a number of preventative measures that you can take for reporting the challenges that you are observing. And again, a means to enable you to keep a track of it, to make sure that the council know about it, they're tracking it, they'll be recording it, they'll be using it as useful data to influence other plans. And it just gets us to think proactively. In terms of local communities, again, I'm sure colleagues who might perform the role of clerk, or again, councillor colleagues, will no doubt be aware of some areas that habitually become problematic. This time of year, you get a lot of leaves about, you get lots of drains. Again, people make the assumption that someone else is reporting it. A good strategy or policy is to get proactive. Using this facility here, this portal into the County Council website, is a great way just to raise awareness to the council, to get some action on the ground to try and prevent some of these challenges, because the cumulative nature of them are the things that lead to wider problems. And again, if the services do not know about them, again, we're looking at response measures to try and overcome the problem before it's you know, when it's probably too late. So moving on to the next section, I'd like to turn to Tina again in terms of looking at the assessment of risk. We've mentioned earlier today about how we know when problems are impending, but the Environment Agency presents some very useful tools to help us get a bit more ahead of the plot from a warning and informing perspective. So Tina, can I hand over to you, please?
Yeah, hi. It's really important that everybody checks their flood risk. And if you go onto the gov.uk website, you can check your flood risk from coastal, fluvial and surface water, and how at risk you are. If you are at risk from coastal or from fluvial, you would be able to sign up for flood warnings. There's some places that don't have a flood warning. My phone's ringing, just typical. So it's really important that they sign up for flood warnings. And you can get all this information from, why do they always ring when you're in the middle of doing something? To get the flood warnings. Can you put on the next slide for me, please? So if you sign up for flood warnings, you get alerts, flood warnings and severe flood warnings, and we put them under the banners of Prepare, Act, Survive. So if you get a flood alert, you are kind of really thinking about that flooding is, that you need to be aware really, and actually think about what might happen. A flood warning is obviously much more serious. We would advise to turn off gas, water and electricity, start thinking about moving things upstairs and to safety, and moving your car to higher ground, that sort of thing. Sometime if it's with coastal, we always have so much more time than if it's fluvial. And because fluvial can happen so much quicker, especially if you have an ice melt. Whereas with high tides, we're looking at the tides, and you may have 12 hours notice, which is a lot of time to move things to safety, move your car, evacuate, go and stay with friends, that sort of things. So that's a flood warning. And then obviously severe flood warnings. It's a risk to life, and this is where that you would have already been evacuated from the property. We really want people to stay safe, but basically if you're still in danger, you would have to call 999 to be rescued. So that is you kind of prepare, act, survive. And so getting flood warnings, you can have them by text, by email, landline, mobile. You can have it in various ways. But also if you've got, you know, your a friend or a mother-in-law who lives, you know, in a high flood risk area, or they might be vulnerable, you could also get the risk. You could get flood risk for an area that's not your own, if you know what I mean. So that's something that everybody can do, and because actually, if you're aware of it, you can anticipate the risk, and you can try and do something about it. If you don't know, then you know it's a difficult thing to be aware of.
And Tina, sorry, Tina, just to confirm, there is no fee for these services. They're all free, aren't they?
Oh, yeah, it's a free service. Gov.uk, sign up, and you'll get flood warnings come through to your whatever device you would like it to come through to. So if you go on to the next slide.
So I was just going to make a comment as well, is just sort of building on what you've just said there. If you had local people in your team that had signed up to these alerts, you know, community groups would get a good early heads up with this to put some actions in the ground.
Yeah, I would expect all parish councils to, as part. We'll go on to this in a minute about community flood plans, but actually having the parish council signed up for flood warnings is really important. Can you just hold on for 1 second? Because I had a flood this morning in my house and the plumber has just knocked on the door. So give me 1 second and maybe you can look at some of the questions for 1 second.
I'd like to say to colleagues that we'd actually planned a live flood doing this. But hopefully Tina can speak to her plumber and join us shortly. But I think just building on the principles, what we're talking about here is if we see alerts as intelligence coming into your team that gives you time to consider the types of things that you might want to do, it's a great starting point in terms of not only anticipating the scale of the problem that you might deal with, working on the principle that you know your local communities, you know what may be certain types of rainfall dynamics can mean to certain parts of your community. Again, Liz, whilst Tina's sort of offshot at the moment, you've got that sort of embryonic stages in Watton at the moment, haven't you, with regard to the team that you're looking to put together in due course with regard to being activated based on good sound weather information and intelligence? Would you just like to talk to us briefly about that for us?
Because we are one of the 16 areas in the first tranche of Lord Danat's strategy, and Richard is working with us and the town council on our emergency plan. I mean, we'd have already thought we needed to have flood wardens who could alert vulnerable people. And one of the things about surface water flooding is that it's quite difficult to get warnings that are useful to a community from outside of the community. And one of the things that the National Flood Forum and people on that talk with us say, it's very important that you don't cry wolf too often. So you say, oh, there's going to be flooding, and then there isn't. So actually, before Lord Danat's team got all set up, I've managed through the National Flood Forum to get onto something called the Flood Forecasting Centre, and they send me every day a risk of level of flooding in the whole of England, and then it gets narrowed down. That's a similar kind of weather forecast that the emergency planning officers in the county get from the civil, whatever bit of the Met Office it is. And because we know when rain is going to really affect us, we can try and flag up on social media and visiting people and so on as much as we can. But we need to refine all that, and people need to be trained, as Richard was saying, so that they're not at risk. And that's something that we will eventually be hoping to do when we get our plan more together. Is that what you wanted me to say, Richard?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Liz, for that. That really sort of consolidates the point. I think when we go back to, or thinking about when we talked about the assessment of risk, you know, what we're talking about today is in terms of developing that sort of community response ethic here and the types of things that we can do. Obviously, we're talking about flooding today, and there are no doubt various different types of challenges, whether it be climatic challenges into our community, heavy snow, cutting people off, people who are vulnerable. So we can understand what the risk is, but it's also important to know who is at risk. And I think this is really vital stuff for our parish colleagues to think about this in a wider sense, and I'm sure you already do, is about who is actually at risk. Who is that person living on their own? When do certain weather dynamics, in this case, whether it be flooding, snow or cold or other climatic challenges, is that when that person is at their most vulnerable, and who's going to go and check on them to make sure they're all right? What type of plans could we have in place to go and support people? Because if the emergency services don't know where they are, or what the challenges what the challenges are, then we can't respond. But in many cases, it's also about understanding what the thresholds of risk are, and really saying, well, what could we do in certain instances when maybe the emergency services aren't required? And I think it's the basis of self-resilience and localized emergency planning, which is what we're going to be talking about in the next phases of the presentation. But in Tina's absence, what I'll do is just move on brief. Oh, hi. Oh, welcome back.
Thanks for coming back. Sorry.
Okay, that's great.
Can I bring up something?
Certainly.
Can I bring up something, please?
Certainly,
you were talking about getting flood warnings from the government.
Right.
I've just tried it. We don't give flood warnings for this address. That's Sam Tony. We flood.
Wait, can you push it back the slide, Richard, please? Right, no, next one. No, you've gone too far. No. So,
here?
Yeah, but so you've put your postcode in, and it's there's no flood warnings for that area.
No, it doesn't say that. It says we do not give flood warnings for this address.
Do you want to put a message in the chat, or send me an email directly, and I'll look into it for you?
I'll send you an email. My chat doesn't seem to be working.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right, that's all right.
Hi, Nick. Hi, Nick. I know I've got Nick's email. I can certainly send it over to you, Tina. So I think we'll be able to try and get Nick's clarification on that. But if we can move forward, I'm very mindful of the time, Tina.
Can I just go back a slide? Can I just go back to the flood warnings? Right. Can I just talk about this slide first? So this was a flood. This was a flood warning that came out for England just before we went into lockdown, which seems like forever ago. But actually, you can see this was Storm Kira and how it affected the country. Obviously, in our part of the country, we're only on flood alerts. But actually, as a country, we were 5 severe flood warnings, 225 flood warnings, and 293 flood alerts. So actually, this is the sort of information that people in local communities can get, not for surface water, I'm afraid, but for everything else. So yeah, you can move on to.
So weather warnings. Tina, do you just give us a brief overview of weather
Yeah,
warnings?
I mean, as local communities, and I think Liz sort of is absolutely spot on with what she was saying. So much of it's down to local knowledge, and if you've got a local expert, even better. But people in the community will all go, well, I know when that river gets to that lamppost, that the three houses at the bottom of the street are going to flood, or whatever local angle it might be, because they live there, they've seen it, whether they live on the coast or by a river, they know that. But actually, but also if they're really switched on, I mean, I have the weather warnings, the Met Office weather warnings on my phone. I can see what's happening all the time. But if you live in an area where it's the likelihood of flooding is strong, then obviously these are more tools, because the more tools you've got, the better decisions that you can make as you move forward.
Thanks for that, Tina. Okay, you're just going to move forward on just to summarize again, surface water flooding and the unpredictable nature of it. And again, just looking at in some cases, whilst the weather forecast might not present the magnitude or the threat that would naturally promote the thinking that we have an impending mass problem, is in some cases where you know, a minimal amount of rain and again preceded with high groundwater or other dynamics can actually present some really quite serious challenges. So surface water flooding is really unpredictable. But again, just to summarize the points that other colleagues have made, is that if you know your community, you know where those locations are. And wouldn't it be good if you knew of what the dynamics look like, the types of things that we might be able to do from a local perspective, just to raise awareness or give people an early warning of the things they might wish to do, or if unfortunately if they have been compromised with flooding, the types of support mechanisms they might need. And remembering that, you know, I'm going to talk about recovery in a minute, but you know, a flood displacement, a person could be out of their house for 6 months. After a few days, people might forget about them. Well, what about supporting them after that? What sort of things could we do to help them? And again, this is about self-reliance programs and actually seeing how we can do something to support these people and hopefully try and restore some sort of normality. I think I've mentioned quite a lot today about the extremely hazardous nature of particularly with all flooding, but how quickly surface water flooding can present itself. And again, looking at the historical knowledge out there, and the fact that you are your local experts, you will always know more than your local police officer, unless that obviously that officer actually lives and works in your particular locality. I mean, I know I speak from the fire and rescue service perspective. Our retained colleagues, the men and women in the retained service, live in our communities, and so have a good level of awareness of the dynamics in their local communities, because they're typically responding to the floods when it occurs. But in many areas, that knowledge is not always there, and I know that, you know, parish colleagues will know. You know your backyard, you know these challenges, and you know where they are, and it's really important we don't lose sight of that, and we record them, because it's vital evidence and support and information to support emergency response plans. Charlie, would you like to just give us a quick overview around cold weather and the ways that we might think about considering it in light of a bigger picture?
Yeah, of course. Just sort of quite quickly, cold weather health watch systems are in operation from 1st of November till the 31st of March. And then if there's anything, a warning sort of outside of those times, or something that looks like a breach of thresholds, then you'll get an extraordinary warnings put out as well. You can see those two threshold value sort of points are there, and they sort of inform what the different levels are that change. So level 1 being minimum risk. Level 2, when you've got a 60% chance of a breach of one of those two thresholds above, and then level 3 is when you've got a breach being experienced at the time. That then triggers additional actions by Public Health England and the health and social care systems to target those individuals who are particularly highly at risk. And then a level 4, that's a national emergency, and that would the definition for that would be that the severity of the situation is impacting more than just health and social care systems, and you're seeing individuals who are outside of that vulnerable sort of list, vulnerable persons list, also being impacted by such weather. Hope that's useful.
Yeah, that's excellent, Charlie, because flooding is horrendous, but you know, flooding with severe cold weather is really another game changer in terms of life risk and the challenges for displaced people. So I think if we take it in that context, it's just for our colleagues just to think about other intelligence or information that might inform us about enacting plans and the things to think about. So I can just quickly move on now to personal flood planning, and Tina, if you wouldn't mind just giving our colleagues an overview on the concept of this. And again, there is a hyperlink for colleagues after the meeting for you to consider.
There's lots of tools around to actually think about planning your flood risk, and we'll talk about community planning, community flood plans in a minute. But this is a kind of just an easy to fill in a form that you should be encouraging the people in your parishes, especially if they're at high risk of flooding, to actually think about what they would do in a flood. And actually sometimes just going through that process actually makes them think about what they would do, what are the things they'd want to, you know, save, you know, the non-replaceable things that you would never get back again, those sorts of things. And if you were kind of leaving the house, it's the sort of thing that I go through with the young children all the time. And we have big conversations about which toys they would take with them. But actually, it's really thinking about, you know, if you're having to leave in an emergency, you know, have you got a spare set of medication that you can take? If you're not just thinking about your own house, but if you're thinking about your neighbours, and your vulnerable people, how they get out of the house, if you've got pets, all those sorts of things about how you would think about your personal flood planning. And the more people that have got a personal flood plan, the more resilient they're going to be. Okay.
Thanks for that, Tina. If I can just move on to the next section around the types of numbers that you should have at your close hand to enable support and information. Charlie, would you just like to go over the floodline numbers and this slide for us, please?
Yeah, of course. So the one of the points that was sort of identified from the NSFA Norfolk Strategic Floodlines was the point that the frustration of individuals that didn't know who to report certain issues to, calling the wrong numbers, either tying up emergency service individuals or being frustrated when legitimate concerns weren't being actioned. Therefore, they set up the new sort of one number floodline, calling that MAN 24/7. It's you can reach Anglia Water, EA and NCC, sort of will redirect and patch through. It's there's also a number of individuals. There's this has been sort of publicised in local newspapers, radio. It was flyed to a number of communities. It's just a one-stop shop for where to report flooding. You know, when it's coming to your door, you don't want to be searching through trying to work out who to call. You just want to be able to call someone and get help. So that's the number that was created to assist in that process.
Thanks for that, Charlie. So there's a number of response options. Charlie's just gone through the floodline number there. Again, it's a very useful number. And if you reflect back on the early part of this presentation around call volume going into the emergency service, in this case, Norfolk Fire and Rescue Service, it's probably likely that some of those calls maybe could have been absorbed using that number to enable more life relevant calls to go straight through in the 999 system. And again, it's all part of a means of managing the risk, a local perspective, and certainly assist the emergency services to enable our resources to be directed to those that need it in priority order. And it just leads me on really to re-establish that point, or and really enforce that point, is that where there's any doubt around risk to life or animals or property, 39's always, if in doubt, turn emergency services out. It won't be a problem if there's any doubt with the nature of your challenge. The call handlers are highly trained professionals handling that call, and we'll be able to determine the best route and response for the nature of your problem. But the previous number that we were talking about there, that's this 03444 or 44800 8013 number, is certainly one that you want to keep at your disposal to enable you to direct people to get that one-stop shop sort of information to try and help resolve your problem. So response. I've been talking around developing community risk plans. In many cases, we've talked about the types of information that might trigger a level of action that is proportionate to the nature of the problem that you're trying to manage. And so in many cases, you know, the activation thresholds, I might want to describe it as, might easily be established by your local group or your local council to activate a plan. Now, in Norfolk, we have quite a few parish areas and groups that have plans, and indeed colleagues already on this call might well already have a plan established or be working on one. But certainly these thresholds or these triggers enabled us to activate localized actions where in some cases the full need or the weight of response of emergency services might not be required because there is no life risk or any of the other more serious risks that I've been talking about earlier in the presentation. So the need to think about development plans, again, whether it be flooding or cold weather response plans, is something we now want to discuss and sort of move on to. This slide here again has other numbers and contact information, the Environment Agency numbers there for you to take record of. And again, there is another hyperlink here to the Norfolk County Council website that enables you to dynamically report risk of flood or the presence thereof, and it helps the council no end to able us in the council to direct resources to those problems and try to resolve the problem that other people are experiencing. So please take a note of these numbers if you don't already got them, and again, keep them close to hand within your sort of administration instructions, because they're really, really valuable numbers. So if we look at recovery, many people think recovery or recovery phases is towards the latter part of the response phase, but really from a professional emergency planning perspective is something that really needs to start right at the beginning. You speak to any emergency service planning cell for large scale incidents, the instigation of a recovery team or recovery cell is put in place very, very early on when the threat assessment directs us to think that we could have quite a significant level of disruption in the community or to our services. And again, recovery, when we define it as the point at which normality is returned, and we correlate that to the examples we've been talking about with regard to people maybe being displaced from their homes for 6 months and all the trauma that goes with that, with all members of our community based on their impairments or disablements and all these other challenges that our communities have to face, is recovery is multifaceted. And again, only you know these people where they are, or you know people who may know where they are. And it's this type of information that is so vital to emergency services when a problem occurs, or to you if you're looking to activate your own systems to get an intervention in or response in, just to check up if someone's all right, or maybe to advise people where a problem is about to occur for them to think about enacting their localized flood plans, for example. So disruption, displacement, what I would like you to think about sort of from a rhetorical perspective and just to go away with thinking around is, what sort of support could you give? How could that support be delivered? How long would the disruption to your community last in the case of a flood? I know from the COVID pandemic, there's been some fantastic initiatives out there in the community where people have got together and doing some really good high quality welfare checks. And so that there is that type of ethos out there already, and it can be applied more widely as well to the types of problems that we're talking about in terms of general emergency management. Again, we've talked about individuals, but how does the overall community recover? Again, it's a big question. If there's a large scale displacement, a coastal inundation, for example, what sort of leadership style would we need in the localities to just trying to get that back to normality, that recovery process underway, and get people back online and get back to their normal lives? And finally, they're looking at the psychological impact. Again, both as communities, the massive challenges of displacement, but also for you as local community leaders, that's quite a challenging thing. And you know, leadership, like I mentioned earlier, can be quite a lonely place at times. But as teams, I'm absolutely convinced, by talking about it amongst ourselves, forecasting what the likely problems could be, planning for them, even exercising for them, are the types of things and the ways we want to be thinking around in terms of options that could be available to us to try and support our communities and enhance our levels of response from a parish perspective. If I can move on and just look at the nature of emergencies in terms of definition, Charlie mentioned earlier the Civil Contingencies Act and Category 1, Category 2 responders. The definition of an emergency that I've presented up there, and I'm not going to read it all out to you now, but you can see it's a wide-scale definition of a very serious event that threatens our environment or threatens the security of the UK. But it's, you know, it can be moderated, it can be made adaptable to suit the types of emergencies that you may foresee within your community. So if you foresee particular types of challenges, what might they be? How would you go about managing them? How could you support the communities? What sort of coordination would they need? What sort of problems would they need to overcome, and how could you support them? And again, it's all about scalability. In many cases, and when we look at emergency plans in a bit more detail, it's not always about identifying the problems. It's also maybe identifying the people that can provide the solutions to the problems. For example, I know colleagues in the agricultural fraternities have various different types of specialist plant, four-wheel drive, those types of vehicles that can get through difficult weather conditions in all weathers and all climates. And so this is not all about looking at identifying the threat and the problem. It's also about looking at what potential solutions lie out there within our communities and how can we embed them within our plans to see what we can do for ourselves as much as working with the emergency services. So emergency plans are there on the ground. So what might they look like? And so what I'd like to do now is just go to Charlie now, and he'll give you an overview of the types of planning process that are out there and maybe how to get a plan off the ground. Charlie, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Sorry, I was just writing something in the chat there as well. So there are a number of templates already available on the Norfolk Pred website that we continue to update to try and make them appropriate and applicable, to make them as easy and accessible for all those to use. As mentioned, the district emergency planners are the individuals that should be that lifeline between, or that communication line between the parishes and sort of through to the local authorities. The NRF is there to assist and support, but they have the information. They need to understand and have those lines of communication so that they can assist you. So I think, and some of the things that I'm looking at procuring as part of the NRF are a communications system called eShot, which would allow us to text and email individuals by geographic location to provide them warnings. So as Richard's already mentioned, there's lots of things that can be done that you can have as access as apps to the Met Office, to warnings to the EA, so that you're forewarned and forearmed. But the most important thing is making sure that if you are at risk, that you've got a plan in place. And that can be quite a daunting process to try and really put together. So a handrail and a template is always useful. No one likes having to come up with their own with great ideas off the bat. That's why we're trying to support these things. So we're trying to, at the moment, we're just trying to, it's a bit of a chicken, well, it's a progressive system. So we need to open the communication and make sure that the parishes are communicating with the emergency planning officers so that both know what each are doing and how each can mutually support each other. That line of communication is so important as part of the preparation and mitigation processes. So what we want is to make sure that information is conveyed from, if we hold a strategic coordination group with a 3-day warning of snow melt leading to high rivers and potentially flooding in a location, we need to make sure that EPO, emergency planning officer, is sending that information to the parishes involved at the earliest opportunity, because then the community action plan can then inform, can sort of mobilize. You can start getting those sandbags, those flood boards, those actions, sorry, sandbags, apologies, but you can start putting into action those processes that support the community. So, but we can't do that unless we've got those lines of communication known and open. So as we've talked about, Norfolk Prepared does have a number of options for support there, and you know your communities best. Secondary to this, and just following up on the last bit before we change slides, I know I'm tying this up, is the fact that once we've got those lines of communication, we can then understand what resilience groups are in existence and how we can better improve on both communication and coordination. So the information is coming back up, so that when Norfolk, the NRF, is helping coordinate category 1 or 2 assets like high volume pumps, we've got the information coming up from the ground and getting it through sources trusted, i.e. flood resilience groups, etc., being set up. So we will benefit from this, and we can deliver a better service provided we understand and have those communication links. So that's basically what I'm trying to, that's why I'm quite passionate about trying to make, improve and assist people on these processes. Next slide, I think, hopefully. Perfect. So as mentioned, the link there, again, all links going to be on the website, as I've gone ahead slightly on some of these slides. But as we develop those plans, then we can then also identify, what we're trying to do is make sure that we keep local faces to local problems. And so once you've identified, if you need, what the risks are within your area, because it might not just be flooding, there might be a number of other local risks that you need to consider, and you can see those on the community risk register on the Norfolk Prepared website. You can see what's the requirements, what processes you need to put in place, how, whether it's opening up village halls, supporting individuals, having action plans, having communication plans, finding out who you can mobilize to assist. It's all things that can be done, but, sorry, dog's going, but it's all there to assist and support. So use the links, reach out to emergency planning officers, and hopefully we can create a much more joined up system of resilience across the county. Finally, when the emergency planning officers get in touch with you, and they will also be offering this e-shot system, which is basically just a communication tool. It's a text and an email. It allows us to communicate the risk to you when we see them coming. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Charlie. I just picking up what Charlie said there about the emergency planning officers. The link at the bottom of this page, once clicked, takes you to a number of templates that Charlie was just detailing, and it's also got the respective email addresses of all the emergency planning officers that are active within the county. So, for example, South Norfolk, Breckland, there is the link within the link here that gives you the respective EPO email address should you need to make contact with them. What I'd like to do now is just finally move to Tina. Tina is going to talk to you about flood plans from a community perspective. So, Tina, would you?
Yep. Right. So if I spoke earlier about having a personal flood plan as part of your kind of your parish emergency plan, it's really important to have flood plan and flood plan guidance within that plan. This document, if you go through to this part of the gov.uk website, there's lots of planning advice for groups, the different types of flooding, there's templates, there's advice and tips, and there's obviously activation guidance as well. So if you go to this document and download it, there's lots of information for actually setting up your, having a flood plan for your community. There's another document I've got, which I will send to Jeremy. It's a link actually, and I'll get him to post it out to you all. And it's a document that's an online document, so it's always updated. It's all about kind of community flood risk. It's got case studies in it. It includes a lot of the blue book guidance about how much materials cost and how much different flood protection is, and whether it's low cost, medium cost, high cost. Lots and lots of really good information. So I will send that link out to Jeremy, and he can share it with all the members of NALC as an aside to what the rest of the stuff that's going on. But I've sent it out to a few emergency planning officers because they thought it was a really good document. It's been compiled by the Environment Agency. I think it was Cornwall District Council, a lady called Mary Donahue, who's like a kind of, she's a community activist around flooding, been flooded numerous times in the West Country. So it's a really, really good document, and there's loads of really good information, and it's easy to read. So it's the sort of thing that you can share with your own community, your own councillors, your own on your parish council, and it's actually kind of a really good document. So I will share that with you after that. But I think the thing is, there is so much information out there that is available to make you have really good plans, but in a community setting, it's the community that has to make the decisions on those plans because they know the community. Nobody else. I don't know about your. I can be, the flood resilience engagement advisor covers Norfolk, but actually I do not know about your parish. I know about my village. I know where it floods in my own village, but actually I do not know about yours. And that's why having community groups and community or having that whole kind of emergency planning group, including the flooding, is really, really important. And I think we're now on to the last slide. I'll hand back to Richard.
We are, Tina, and I think before we open it up to questions, I'm sure everyone would agree. Hopefully for you as the participants this afternoon from your respective parishes, we hope to have given you a very rapid tour of the world of flooding, and I think hopefully the people that have been talking to you this afternoon come from a wealth of experience of actually dealing with the challenges associated with flooding, and also the actual ground truth perspective from Liz there of working in that sort of flood local arena. And I'm sure there's probably lots of questions, and I have to apologize to my colleagues now because I haven't actually been monitoring the chat. But if I can just turn to Liz. Liz, before we go up to any final questions from the floor, is there anything you'd just like to add before we turn over to everybody for any questions, please, Liz?
It is difficult. I mean, I think that if one of the problems is people who've been flooded are often the people who have the fire in the belly to do something about it. But the reality is that getting action in any community is a long time. And we've taken 4.5 years to get our action. I hope it's not going to take so long for others because Lord Dannett's task force is in place. But I would encourage parish councils to see if there are people in their community who would wish to take part. I think it's very difficult. I mean, our group has 2 people who work full time, and the other 5 of us are all older and retired, but feels like a full-time job sometimes. So it's very difficult, I think, to get volunteers. And I also think that how to attract them and get them is quite a challenge because there's so much information out there and notices out there and Facebook things out there, and even putting things in the EDP or something. If people don't think it relates to them, they don't see it. So but yes, I think encouraging local residents and there may well be experts. I mean, we would love to have a drainage expert so that we could challenge some of the things that Anglian Water say to us. But our wonderful drainage engineer, who was a lovely man of 80, sadly died and left us in the lurch. And we were very sorry to lose him because he did know about things like that. And it's quite difficult to challenge things like that. I think that's probably enough.
Thanks for that, Liz. In terms of moving forward to the next stage, that sort of concludes the presentation. And if we can move to any questions, if I can just go to Charlie and Tina, who are monitoring the chat, is there any particular questions that we need to raise now towards the latter part of the presentation?
one of the queries that came up about that not everybody's on the internet and doesn't have access to, which is a major issue. But that's when the community needs to work together, because it will be the community who know the people who are vulnerable, the people who don't have access, and that actually they can communicate those messages to them. Because obviously, as organisations, you know, with limited funds, it's that is the way that we have to get stuff out. I know recently we're, you know, door dropping information, but when things are need to be done quickly and urgently, it has to be done through the internet. Obviously, if we've got tidal surges, we'll always use the radio. So your BBC Radio Norfolk would have all our information on if we were, and we always encourage people to dial into those stations so they get the up-to-date information, because our comms team would be sharing it, and the same with Norfolk County Council would be sharing it with BBC Radio Norfolk. So that would be in an emergency situations, if we're having a big tidal surge. But on your kind of day-to-day, you know, we are really relying on online and you know, texting and messaging.
Yes, I fully agree with the best first route is probably to get into internet, and again, just to recap, the Norfolk County Council website is a really good portal to gain information. But if you don't actually have those accesses, and maybe that's something that the local clerk could maybe access information for parishioners, but also just drawing attention to, you know, the number there at the bottom there, the flood number, the 0344 number. Again, that's another really useful number to have in your armoury. It is more in response mode, not in preparatory mode. But what it actually enables you to do is to speak to a highly trained call handler for a non-emergency situation, because if it's an emergency, obviously we're going to ring 39s. But the nature of the call can certainly direct you to the best advice, or if not, if the council's not the first go-to organisation to help you with your problem, it will direct you to the organisation or group that is best suited to the nature of the challenge that you are trying to deal with. So again, registering and acknowledging that not everybody unfortunately has the internet, but there is still the 0344 number, and again, that's one you definitely want in your pocket. Any more questions coming from the floor from the team?
Could I raise one? I'm afraid my video is not working. Who applies pressure to farmers to clear field ditches and roadside ditches? Because certainly we've had road flooding here, which pretty certainly is responsibility or a result of roadside ditches not being cleared. And as a general comment, the system for reporting to the county about blocked drains is fine, but the time taken to actually achieve physical reaction, certainly on a road near us, it took 6 months between the fault being reported and the sucker vehicle actually turning up to do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for the question. Tina, would you just like to give an overview on riparian land owner perspective? This is obviously Michael's point around
well,
you know, wider land issues.
Yeah, if it's to do with ditches, I wouldn't know because obviously it's a county council, because it's affecting the highway. If it's a main river that runs through a landowner, they do have responsibility to keep it clear, or then again, it might not necessarily be kept clear, because actually sometimes we want it not to be clear because we want to slow the flow. So it really depends where it is and how, because actually sometimes clearing something would actually cause more flooding in a bigger area. And although, you know, with farmers and farmland being flooded, you know, they obviously hate it. We'd rather have farmland flooded than a town. So it's kind of, you know, and is that farmland oh God, I've forgotten the word for it. Floodplain, floodplain. But we can take the responsibility away from the farmer or the landowner and clear, but it all depends, because sometimes if the river's too wide, too deep, and they are never going to clear it, we take the responsibility of doing it. But it would then have to go on our program. It would only be cleared once a year. And obviously we're, you know, the amount of money that we have to do this it doesn't seem to be getting any more, if you know what I mean. So yeah. I think whether it's the county council, environment agency, Anglian Water, money is always going to be an issue. If we had all the money in the world, you do all sorts of things. Yeah. But also sometimes what we used to do in the past doesn't mean to say that we'd do it in the future, because of the way that, you know, the modelling has gone and what works and what's better, because, you know, we don't want it to increase the flooding elsewhere. So it's a very difficult picture.
Yeah, Tina, just to pick up on that is, again, within the hyperlink with regard to the prevention phase in the presentation, just going back to Michael's question, there is a section in the County Council domain that talks about riparian landowners and the types of engagement that you can deal with. And I guess that from a parish council perspective, it's very likely that you will know who the owner is of that land. And so the first logical step would probably be to engage or approach that person and see what traction could be made in terms of alleviating the problem. But also going back to that sort of depository of information on the council website to sort of seek the sort of more detailed advice. I mean, in some cases you might not actually know who the landowner is, and again, you know, there's mechanisms out there with land registry to try and establish who the owner is in the first instance. But I don't know if we've completely answered your question there, Michael, but hopefully we've gone some way to try and give you some feedback in the nature of your question.
Yeah, it's roadside ditches I'm talking about, where we've certainly at Christmas were cut off from a couple of local villages because of the depth of water on roads. And one always gets the impression that clearing roadside ditches is not a priority, but the impact on travel and where properties entered people's gardens, if not houses, can be quite important. Anyhow, thank you for the answer.
Yeah, just to add on to your point there, Michael, and just trying to look at the emergency resilience issue as well, it's important to know the nature of the road that has been compromised. I mean, any road that's been blocked with floodwater for some time it becomes a point where it's more than just an inconvenience. But again, if it's an arterial route into a remote area, again, you know, added emphasis on the nature of that road in terms of emergency service vehicle use for ambulance, etc., etc. Again, added detail to that reporting of that problem, hopefully would bring greater emphasis on trying to resolve it.
Michael,
I wish I could answer your question in more detail. Liz, over to you.
Michael, where are you in Norfolk?
Harleston.
Right. Do you know who your area highways manager is?
Yes, and he knows who I am as well.
Right. So he's not helping you.
Shall we say that our local county member is somebody I know as a councillor, and without naming names, I think I only got action in the end by direct personal lobbying of a county councillor who then muscled an officer, to put it bluntly.
Well, I was asking partly because, I mean, Tina referred to it too. I mean, understanding it's not just money, it's lack of personnel to do things, and all of them, the LFA, highways and so on. And it is about building those relationships. And sometimes you do have to get muscle from councillors to help.
Yes.
And it's taken us a long time, and I hope it doesn't take you too much longer.
Right. Thank you very much indeed. I've enjoyed the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Anybody else have any questions that we can seek to answer? I was just going to make a point, just again further on Michael's point. Again, you know, agricultural communities again have major assets in the way that I would view it. I mentioned earlier about 4x4 capability, and again supporting the community. I'm sure many sort of colleagues in the agricultural communities are all too well into to try and support and resolve the problems, and again would be a valuable contact stroke asset to any detail within the development of any community plans to try and restore some sort of normality around, you know, the recovery phases of these challenges. I think there was a hands up, and sorry, I missed who it was, but I think there's another question. If you'd like to fire away, apologies, I missed your name.
Hi, it's Kerry here from Hemsby Parish Council. I raised in the chat, we'd been contacted by the Norfolk and Suffolk County Council Reclaim the Rain project. What I keep finding at the moment, since our parish has appeared on sort of a wave list as a parish that's subject to flooding, both coastal and surface water flooding, we keep getting invited to these things, but we're never quite sure as to whether there's an overlap or an interlink. I did raise this last week as well at a different forum that I was attending.
Charlie, did you want to respond to that?
Thank you. Yeah, I actually, in perfect honesty, I'm not sure about the Reclaim the Rain project. I know there's Catch project as part of NCC. I'm not aware of that. I'll if it's okay, can you leave that with me, and I'll have a look and try and get directly back to you if that's okay, Kerry?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. On the email, it says it's towards DEFRA, 6-year-long innovation resilience fund project. If that gives you any more background to it, I can happily send you, Charlie, the link, so you can feed in. But it's saying that my parish is one of trying to find here now, I think it's 28 parishes that have been identified as, 36 shortlisted parishes in Norfolk are named at risk. So, and as I say, ours has already been identified by the Norfolk Flooding Alliance as well.
Okay,
Gary and Charlie, I think it may be something to do with Anglian water.
No, I think it's actually the NSFA, Liz. But I think Charlie has.
But through the NSFA, I think it's Anglian water, maybe. But no, maybe not.
Okay, I think we'll get to the bottom of it. But if is there another question? I think
It's Tina here. I have a feeling it's something to do with capturing water that we can then use on farmland, because actually we go through the summer and farms in Norfolk are taking too much water out of the catchment, and then we've got all this water that we chuck in the sea. I think it might be something to do with that, but
okay, we'll look into it. Mima Garland, I think you've got your hand raised. I think this might have to be the last question, because I think we've got 3 minutes left on our time slot.
Hello,
Hi.
Richard. Thank you.
Hi, Mima.
My name is Mima Garland, Burnham Thorpe Parish Council. I've got 2 or 3 questions on the chat, and I look forward to getting answers for them. Apologies, I've got quite a lot of feedback. So if that's the case for others, I'll be quiet and leave the questions to be answered.
Okay, thanks for that. We'll look into it and get back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jeremy, I think we're about to run out of time. Is it just heading back to you? Is there anything you'd like to do? Is bringing the webinar?
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for that. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me, Richard? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. No, I'd just like to bring the meeting to a close, the webinar to a close. I'd like to thank Richard, Tina, Liz, and Charles for presenting. It's been really, really informative. I know that you said in your own words, I think you'd skimmed the surface, but it has been a rapid tour. We've got lots of information here. I think all the parish and town councils have got a lot of information here. We will, as I said, I will share the presentation. I will copy the chat. We will try and get the answers to yourselves as well. What I would say to everybody is, if you want a follow-up, if you want some more information, etc., please tell me, and I will organise that for you. So parish and town councils, if there's anything else that you want to follow up on, if you want another webinar to follow up, if you want a specific one on emergency planning, for example, let me know and send me an email, and I will organise it for you. So thank you for that. Thank you for attending. As I said, once again, have a good rest of the day. And what I'll do is close the webinar, and as I said, and have a good, safe rest of the evening. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to have to dash off because I'm going to another meeting. I do apologise.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I was going to stop recording and I'll close out. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you.
I'll speak to you later, Charlie. Thank you.
Cheers.
And send
Charlie.
send me that presentation, Richard, if you haven't already. Just send it.
Yeah,
to me.
I'll send it to you by the end of play today.
Thank you.
And I'll send you that link to that document. I think people find it really useful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tina.
Excellent. Thanks, Liz, for your comments there. It's really, really helpful.